So the theme for MozCon, as I hope you've gathered by now, is the future of SEO. But I'm going to talk more narrowly. I'm going to talk about the future of the SERP itself, so search engine results pages, and that's the last time I will use the full-length version. But I'm talking about the gradual demise of our beloved 10 blue links. But why, as SEOs, I actually think we should welcome it. Now, spoilers, I'm going to say at the end of this talk that I actually expect a much less radical departure than some of you might currently be envisaging. But we'll get to that. On the way, I'm going to talk about Google's present position, problems, situation. I'm going to talk about the limits for what a SERP can be. I'm going to talk about what happens next. I'm going to talk about what you can do right now. But first, if you'll humor me, I want to go on a brief journey through a history of the death of SEO. When I was researching this talk, I decided to look for some of the oldest articles I could find about the death of SEO. This is not actually the oldest article I could find, but this is from 2007, when I was 15. And what is interesting about this article from 2007 is that it is already a roundup of old, obsolete posts saying that SEO is dead. The point being that this is a very stale meme. Now, this has been going on for a long time, but I think the first major death of SEO was in 2003 with Google Ads. Now, there were things before this that were labeled the death of SEO, where people said SEO is dead, but this was mostly very questionable link building techniques not being viable anymore. This was the first time that Google pulled out a big chunk of organic traffic, right? Stealed our lunch. Stole. I can speak English, I swear. Fast forward 9 years, 2012. This is about when I started my career in SEO. And the knowledge graph, once again, killed SEO. Again, detracting from the amount of organic traffic that was available. There's no need to click through if you wanted one of the details that's shown. In 2014, there was one of the all-time great SEO tweets, which I think kind of summed up the mood in this era, and to some degree through to the present day. So if you don't remember or you don't know, Matt Cutts, the guy at the top, he was kind of the John Mueller of this era. And he's asking, if you see a scraper site outranking the original content, please let us know. So a classic case of Google making their inability to deal with duplication someone else's problem. But Dan Barker replies and says, yeah, I think I've spotted a scraper site, and of course, it's Google itself. But this is how a lot of SEOs feel about Google, right? It's like, oh, they're stealing our content, stealing our traffic. SEO is dead. Fast forward to 2019, 2020, Rand put out these studies about zero-click searches, searches which don't result in a click to anything apart from maybe another Google property, not an ad, not organic. And this went quite far. This was even cited in Congress. And very unusually, Google actually directly responded. They said, well, actually, we send more traffic to websites every year. And yet, Google has to say this kind of thing. But of course, they're partly right and partly missing the point. But the point is, over time, more and more features have removed the need to click. These are features from around that time. Some of these features, interestingly, aren't live anymore, but the trend is still going in that direction. However, despite SEO becoming deader and deader and deader, it's also managing to grow and grow and grow. Now, this chart is pretty choppy, and if you're like me, that screams of data issues. But broadly speaking, it is up and to the right. It's certainly not going anywhere. A recent study by Research and Market said that the SEO software business will more than double, nearly triple, between 2020, which is already a pretty good year for SEO, and 2027. So, with all that borne in mind, I want to talk about Google's present predicament and some of the things that the industry has been seeing recently. I've been thinking a lot recently how it's kind of an artifact of Google's dominance that we use them for everything. It might have been imagined once that web search had a much narrower role, finding a website you were looking for. But if you put yourself for a moment in the mindset of yourself as a user, not as an SEO, think of yourself as someone who uses Google, there are many queries where actually you would probably rather not see a website. For example, if you want to know the weather. This is from where I live last week, and as you can see, British summertime is the same as every other time of year in Britain. Consistent rain every day, something teen degrees Celsius. But I don't need a website here, right? Like, clicking through to weather.com would not improve my user experience. Sorry, weather.com. Similarly, I live in the UK, but I work for a company based in Seattle, so I make Google searches about time zones embarrassingly often. Sometimes ones like this as well, currency conversion. I'm also quite bad at speaking English, as we've discussed. And sometimes I need to know the answer to a simple question. Well, need might be a strong word. But, the point is, Google cares, in these cases, about searcher experience. And I'm not suggesting that they're altruistic. They have to. All of these widgets I've just shown you, these cost money to make, design, maintain, produce, and they are not monetized. They are loss leaders, but they keep you in Google's ecosystem. This is an old article now. This is from 5 years ago, and I've mentioned it in basically every talk I've given since, so please take the hint and read it. But this is an article about Google's interest in quickly sating a user intent. Basically, some journalists sat in on a Google search engineering meeting where they were discussing a change they'd made to the SERP, and all of the metrics they were talking about with testing this change were about how quickly the user intent was being satisfied, how quickly the user clicked through to something or reacted. And this is obviously not new. They've been testing constantly for a very long time. They've been making all these algorithm changes. They don't change the algorithm however many times a day just to screw with us. They do it to retain users. They do it to keep their competitive advantage. They are a product with KPIs. They have competitors. They have threats. And broadly speaking, I would suggest that Google retaining users is pretty good for the SEO industry. We tend to see Google as a villain, perhaps rightly so. But as SEOs, we benefit greatly from more people using search engines in general, and also specifically Google. For a lot of the use cases I just showed you, weather, Vin Diesel, this kind of thing, there are tools that are better than web search. And the one that's obviously been discussed and cited most this year is ChatGPT. There are a lot of things for which ChatGPT is a better solution than Google. I think that is uncontroversially true. But Google needs us to keep defaulting to Google. On the left, I present to you the delicatessen aisle in my local supermarket. Is supermarket a word in American English? It's superstore, perhaps? Anyway, on the right, my local butcher's, a small family-run specialist business. Now, the thing is, I cannot buy fabric conditioner, a toothbrush, a bag of potatoes, and a tin of tomatoes at the butcher. That said, the butcher is much better. The butcher's very good, in fact. But nonetheless, the delicatessen aisle in the supermarket only needs to be good enough, and I will just get everything at the supermarket because I'm there anyway. This is Google's situation. But what I want to talk about next is how far can they go updating the SERP to fend off these indirect competitors, these butchers, before something else breaks, before they break their user experience, or before they break their business model, or before they break our willingness as webmasters to cooperate with them, to let our sites be crawled. Now, of course, there is an elephant in the room here. If you're asking how far SERP changes can go, there is a very good example readily available. Now, you may have been living under a rock, and that is fair enough. But if so, I'll briefly explain what this is. So this is a SGE, or Search Generative Experience. This is not something that is widely rolled out right now. You have to have opted in to Google Labs. You have to be on Chrome. You have to be using a US IP address or a VPN. And even then, they don't appear all the time. But this is basically, it's basically a big AI-generated, a generative AI snippet at the top of the SERP. It has some features which are vaguely familiar or equivalent to things we're used to. There's these 3 links in the top right. These are or some of the articles that the AI snippet is based on. They don't work exactly like organic results, but they kind of are technically organic results. I'll talk about the difference a bit more later. And then there's these at the bottom. These are kind of like, in fact, they're very like, people also ask questions. So there's some familiarity here. But the main thing is that this is large. On a lot of queries, on a lot of screen sizes, this is the entirety of the above-the-fold space. You'll also notice this small button in the top right, which takes you to this view, which is a more exhaustive list of the articles that the generative AI is drawing on. So, some stats. All the data I'm about to share with you is based on the top few MozCast keywords from every vertical, tracked in a suburban US location. So this is a relatively small-scale study. This is 100 SERPs. Obviously, I hope in future that we can do studies like this based on hundreds of thousands of or millions of SERPs, like our non-SGE studies. But for now, this is just a relatively small sample, but I think it gives an interesting insight into what's going on right now. Now, like I mentioned, even if you are opted in and all the rest of it, you don't always see an SGE for every query. The most common thing you see is actually a button, which gives you the opportunity to generate one if you want to. And if you click that, it takes probably literally 10 seconds to load, and then bumps the whole rest of the SERP down beneath it. Cumulative layout shift, anyone? Sometimes it's there by default, although even then it still takes some time to load, and sometimes it's not even there at all. I think that's mostly in cases where Google might have legal concerns or something like this. What's interesting is, since I first started playing around, and this is anecdotal, but since I first started playing around with SGEs, I've noticed that they're appearing by default less and less often. Now, there are a few reasons this could be. The most obvious one is that any snippet like this, any generative AI snippet, costs money to produce. At the moment, tools like ChatGPT are massive loss leaders. Presumably, they will get more expensive in time. But Google isn't charging anything for you to use Google Search with SGE enabled. So this is expensive for them to generate the snippet. So that's one reason why they might be doing it a bit less over time. There are some other reasons as well, which I'll come to. What about what's actually in these SGEs? Well, we talked about these 3 links in the top right, which supposedly the snippet is based on. I was interested in the overlap between these and the regular organic links beneath. Interestingly, there's surprisingly little overlap. So in only 13% of cases were all 3 of those articles listed also in the top 10 organic. And in most cases, it was some or none. That's interesting partly because it suggests that this is not just built on top of organic. This is a different system. We also saw that SGEs mostly contained just raw text, like a featured snippet. When they didn't, the most common feature was places, like a map and some local listings. Interestingly, I have never seen ads in a SGE. In the demo at Google I/O, I think in March, maybe, at Google I/O, they were showing examples where there were ads actually embedded in the SGE. I have never seen that in a live SERP. There's also a lot of sort of duplication of functionality or repetition on SGE SERPs. So I mentioned that these buttons at the bottom of the SGE were kind of like people also ask. They're very, very like people also ask. I suspect it's the same system. So this is an example where, scrolling further down the same SERP, there's also a people also ask box with some of the same questions. This is quite un-Google-like, right? This is a duplication, it's a waste of space, duplication of the same functionality. In fact, in 83% of SERPs that had an SGE, they had this duplication of functionalities where there were people also ask questions and the follow-up questions, often overlapping the very same questions. This is quite odd. Maps is another example of the same. So this is a search for coffee shops near MozCon. Now, there are some more and less obvious problems here. I would suggest the most obvious problem is that if you look at that map, it says Missouri. That's not very near MozCon, I wouldn't have said. But also, slightly less obviously, if you look at those links in the top right that it's supposedly based on, they're just links to Google local listings. They're the exact same as the top 3 places listed. This is not very clever at all. In fact, in 35% of cases where you have a map on an SGE SERP, it is duplicated beneath the SGE and in the SGE as well. So, and then you've also got those links in the top right. So it's duplicated or triplicated, I guess, in 3 places. And this can get quite absurd. This is an extreme example. If you can't read this, that's fine. This is a search for veterinarians. And you can see there is 2 maps, a very similar set of local listings replicated in 3 places, a feature snippet, a knowledge panel, an SGE snippet, all doing broadly the same thing. This also has the follow-up and the people also ask further down. This is really bad SERP. Again, not very Google-like. In fact, we found, generally speaking, that the content beneath the SGE is exactly the same as it always was. If you compare an SGE SERP to a non-SGE-enabled, logged-out SERP, they're basically the same, except one of them has this big thing pasted on the top. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that this was built in a rush. Fixed to the top of the SERP without much further thought. Worse than that, from Google's point of view, only 30% of SGE SERPs are monetized in any way at all. And when they are, it tends to look like this, where you've got the ads, which would previously have been at the top, pushed way down. So clearly, there's many problems here. Nonetheless, this might still represent Google's broad direction and thinking. So like I said, I want to talk about some of the limits of how far this could go. 3 types of limits, legal, UX, and commercial. We'll do legal first. Now, you might remember featured snippets also generated some legal problems. Now, featured snippets are really much less questionable than SGE snippets because they're just a piece of your content with a link to your content. They're not plagiarizing without giving a source or saying where they got a particular thing from. They're not at risk of rephrasing it in a way that makes you seem like you said something else. And yet, in some countries, publishers successfully litigated against Google on feature snippets. And indeed, in France now, feature snippets are opt-in rather than opt-out. Now, I would suggest that this was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for the French publishers involved, because a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, they all end up opting in. But the point is, there is a legal precedent here. This is tricky. And SGE is much trickier. We're starting to see a lot of talk now about potential solutions, perhaps revenue sharing. This is not totally uncharted territory. Google has had to have a similar deal, I believe, in Australia with news publishers for revenue sharing, and it looks like something like that might happen in Canada too. However, revenue sharing only really works when you've got a finite number of publishers involved. For example, in mainstream news, where there's like a fixed list of publishers that qualify for Google News, and you can revenue share with with those. For the web in general, it's not really clear how you would do this. What about UX? I think there are some core issues here beyond just execution. This is a tweet from my colleague, Dr. Pete, who you'll see on stage tomorrow. Now, I think this is a strong claim, but it's one I sympathize with. So for a few months now, I've had access to all three, to ChatGPT, to SGE, to the new Bing, and also, of course, to traditional Google search like we all do. And I've kept them all open in tabs to see what I use. And what I've found is, for more complex stuff, so I have to write SQL sometimes as part of my job, but I don't do it often enough to get good at it. So if I want some help writing SQL, I'll use ChatGPT. But for anything other than that, I'll just use regular Google search. The in-between solutions, I've not really found much of a use case for. On top of that, this is Brittany Muller, past MozCon speaker many times, pointing out that in some cases, this is wrong and also dangerously wrong. This isn't dangerously wrong, but this is Cyrus, you just saw on stage, pointing out that it shouldn't take an hour to cook an egg. This is Lily, who you saw on stage first today, pointing out that this is just weird. So this is a request for a list of articles without links to the articles. This is a terrible user experience. Now, to be fair, last week, just in time to mess with the slide deadline, last week, Google did start sometimes linking out. So this is a bit like sort of Wikipedia citations, like linking out to specific articles with each claim. This is a test. I'm not actually in this test bucket, so I had to steal this screenshot from Barry Schwartz. Sorry, Barry. But this is one example. They also have another type, which I am in the test bucket for, which looks like this. So this is linking out to a list of SEO blogs. The trouble with this is what on the right, you have the existing SERP feature. It's kind of the same, except the one on the left is very expensive to generate. So I'm not sure this is much of a victory. And Bing has already been on this journey. So Bing actually beat Google to the punch here. The Bing search engine experience, which isn't called that, Bing called it a story, and you can see there's those gray bars at the top, and it has a similar user experience to like an Instagram story or something like that. So Bing rolled this out before Google, and I was testing it out a bunch at the time. And on the left, you have a screenshot from back in March. And this is what most Bing searches looked like back in March. On the right, you have the same search last month, and you can see I've had to zoom out to find how low they've put the same. They're still bothering to take the cost of generating this AI snippet, but they've pushed it way, way down, which tells you something, right? Like, why would they? They've decided this isn't what users want to see on some level. They're also doing it far less often. So Pete will talk about this more tomorrow, but my point here is that just as web search is not always the right answer to every problem, generative AI is also not always the right answer to every problem. And this is another tweet from Lily Ray with a survey saying broadly the same. SEOs that are using SGEs have not found them a significant improvement in overwhelming number of cases. And you can kind of see this in adoption as well. So I mentioned ChatGPT. ChatGPT is absolutely better than Google search for some things, but it is a more specialized tool. Its adoption is huge, don't get me wrong, but nothing compared to web search. It is a more niche tool. And then commercial limitations, which I sort of alluded to already. This is a Financial Times article with a now famous quote from the CEO of Microsoft. He's saying he's willing to accept the demonetization of search. He might be, but Google cannot. Google cannot demonetize search. They did share a somewhat novel solution at Google I/O. So this is a case where they've got some products embedded in the SGE snippet, and they're Google Shopping listings. So this is a form of monetization. However, I see some problems even here, because this is one of the sites that this is based on, and this is an e-commerce site. So how are they going to feel about Google basically generating a product listings page based on their product listings page, and then not featuring Evan Cycle's products? So this solution is not as good as it looks. You could imagine a world where people don't want to be crawled by Google if they do this kind of thing. And of course, Google Shopping is only valid for the e-commerce space. There's all these other spaces that currently generate a lot of AdWords revenue. You can't solve this just by solving e-commerce. So I've got about 5 minutes left. So what happens next, and what can you do right now? I think I've made it clear, in my view, SGEs cannot be broadly rolled out in their current form. It would be a terrible decision for Google. As I said earlier, they have to care about searcher experience, and this is not a good searcher experience right now. So why did they do it? Well, they were forced to, right? By investors, by pressure from their competitors, by public opinion, obviously a huge amount of hype earlier this year. They were forced to do something to seem like they were at least going tit for tat with Bing. And like I said at the start, I think we should expect a much less radical departure. That said, as SEOs, we can't gamble on this, really. We need to make sure we chart a course that works in both worlds. So what can we do right now? Well, we're talking about a less radical departure, and these are the current most common SERP features on a non-SGE, on a traditional SERP. Now, related searches and PAAs, obviously these are useful for keyword research, but they're not really revenue or traffic opportunities for most sites. But in stat, we have a visibility metric, and if you look at the most visible SERP features, well, you see something interesting, which is that local packs comes out in front. And this is a traffic and revenue opportunity for many businesses. And you might also remember that that was the most common SERP feature inside the AI snippets. So the point here is that Google probably has to build on top of local listings for certain kinds of query, whatever happens. This is something that will be retained in some shape or form. So if you are a brick-and-mortar business, this is a good place to invest. What if you're not a brick-and-mortar business, though? What if, for example, you're a publisher? Well, we talked about this kind of content, right? This is not AI. This is a knowledge graph snippet. It's not as old as Vin Diesel, but these have been around for a decade. So it has been a losing play to make this kind of commoditized, low-value content that would answer a query like this for a long time. And more so over time. If you're a publishing business and your bread and butter is to make the kind of articles that would be comfortably replaced by a short AI snippet, that you were already in trouble before the AI snippet happened. You've been in trouble for a while, actually. However, I've included, I think, 4 screenshots now from the Financial Times in this presentation. They're not, like, in a different life. The Financial Times was my client a few years ago now. And if you're making, they are known for being the last word in well-sourced, well-researched, reasonably neutral, author-written coverage. They are not endangered by SGE snippets, right? They don't need to worry about this. Now, you might not be the Financial Times. That's a high bar. But any content with a human element, this does apply to. The kind of content that people were buying magazines and newspapers for in the first place, before all of this internet malarkey, that kind of content is safe. Lastly, what if you're an e-commerce business? Well, like I said before, similar to local listings, Google Shopping is a system that Google is going to build on either way, like in the present paradigm and in any new one. So those are 3 sort of opportunities that hold up either way. So some closing thoughts. Like I said, just as web search is not the answer to everything, I don't think generative AI is either. I think some of the fears about SGEs killing SEO may be as overblown as the previous fears about things killing SEO. That said, don't expect Google to do nothing. Do not expect them to be complacent. Do not expect them to stand still. They will do what they need to maintain their position, and frankly, we should be grateful for that. I know they're not doing it for us, but it is to our benefit. They make money by sending business to businesses. They have to keep doing that on some level. They have to maintain a paradigm in which ads as a business works. You just need to make sure that you are not at that commoditized bottom end. So, like I said at the start, expect evolution, not revolution, and you can get all these slides at this link. Thank you.